Hey guys, welcome. So this video is a continuation of our previous class, right, where we started to discuss risk management. So as you might remember, our focus has been on risk management, generally speaking, but we are now going to start focusing on risk assessment. And we already discussed, right? We already talked about the difference between risk management and risk assessment. So you might remember that risk assessment is part of risk management. And we finalized our last class talking about risk management frameworks, right? So I also mentioned that we were going to talk about some of those risk management frameworks. Okay, so as you can see in this stage, the framework team begins designing the risk management process by which the organization will understand its current levels of risk and determine what, if anything, it needs to do to bring that level down to an acceptable level in alignment with the risk appetite specified earlier in the process. So at this stage, the organization may select a methodology or it may even decide to develop its own methodology. That's where we stopped in our last discussion, right? So we got to remember that a framework is nothing more than a model or a guideline, basically saying, hey, ideally, according to our belief, the organization or the person, right, or the group that designed that specific framework. So according to our beliefs, this is the correct way or the best way to respond to incident, if that's the case, or in this case, to assess risks, right? So then your organization may simply follow any of those methodologies or design its own. Now, ideally, what you want to do is to pick one of these known methodologies, one of these known frameworks, because obviously your organization is not going to follow that framework uh, exactly as it's designed, right? Exactly as it's been designed, but you need a starting point. You need a reference model, and then you can basically use that model as a reference and adapt to your reality, to your scenario, right? So it's really important that you understand that there are some frameworks, such as the ones that you see here. You have the NIST Cyber Framework, you have the ISO framework. The ISO framework is basically you have the ISO IEC 27000 series, right? Specifically, ISO IEC 27001, that is a model that you can also use, right? The CERT resilience management model, this is a model designed by the Carnegie Mellon University CERT department, right? And you also have, for example, the combination of the CERT RM and the CERT resilience management model with the NIST model, okay? So basically, this is not one specific model, it's just an example. So here I have a link that is basically showing you, giving you an example of how it is possible to combine these methodologies, right, according to your reality. So again, you're basically gonna use these models as a reference according to your realistic scenario, right? Another one is the Google NIST. This is a combination of a Google, I'm sorry, a combination of the NIST cybersecurity framework applied to the Google Cloud, right? So specifically Google Cloud, they basically used the NIST framework as a model, and they adapted that model to their reality, which is an infrastructure in the cloud. So they're basically using that framework But since the framework has been designed for a more generic cyber infrastructure, the Google Cloud adapted that to their specific scenario, which is in the cloud. Okay. Another example, you have the Clearwater Compliance IRM. This is another framework, another risk management framework specifically designed for the healthcare system. Okay, so what it means is you have a risk management framework that specifically addresses the HIPAA regulation. Okay, so the reason why, obviously, it's not important to specifically understand how this tool that is focused on the HIPAA regulation works, but just to show to you that, again, you're basically adjusting these frameworks to your scenario. Okay, we as far as the difference between risk tolerance and risk appetite, that is something that we already discussed in class, right? And now another important thing that you need to understand is risk assessment, right? That is something that you're going to conduct, and risk management, obviously, right? That is something that you're going to conduct focusing on your assets, right? So you're managing risks that can impact on your assets. Obviously, you need to understand what assets you have, right? But that's something that we talked about in the past. At this point, I understand that you already know what your assets are, okay? Now, with that in mind, you also need to understand that, well, so for example, let's take people, human resources, right? That is an information system component. Why? Because human resources, people, employees, they are assets, right? Now, what are the risk management components? Internal personnel and external personnel, right? What that means is, um, your people, they might be impacted by internal personnel and external personnel, right? And what are the risks, right, that you need to manage in order to mitigate those risks associated with that kind of asset? Well, you're going to need trusted employees. You also have other staff members. You have people that you trust outside of the organization, but you also have strangers. So what you need to understand is, for example, obviously, strangers are a risk, or there might be risks associated with strangers, right? Clients are strangers, right? But even if you consider trusted employees, although you trust them, that can actually be even worse, because trusted employees, they will most likely have privileged access, right? And it's not because they're trusted employees that there are no risks associated with them. So, what you need to understand is that people, this asset is very generic, right? Under that type of asset, you're going to have different types of assets, different types of that specific asset, right? And you need to try to identify the risks associated with them, right? Same thing with procedures, right? You have IT and business standard procedures. You have IT and business sensitive procedures. So data, such as file, right? You have data being transmitted, you have data being processed, you have data in storage. That means that's data at rest. So all these different types of asset, or different subtypes of asset, they must be addressed. what you need to understand here is that when we talk about assets, you're thinking about these types here, right? Again, human resources, data, software, network, hardware. But each of these assets, you're going to have different types of each of those specific asset, a type of asset. And you have to um, figure out how to manage risks associated with those types. So basically, what you need to understand here is that risk management is something to be applied to all sorts of components that you have, which shows you that this is very, very complex, right? Now, as far as assessing values in information assets, this is very, very important, okay? This is one of the most important tasks in risk assessment. Why? Because at the end of the day, you are going to, the goal of assessing risks or managing risks is, like I said before, there is no way that you're going to eliminate all risks. You're going to eliminate all vulnerabilities and all threats, right? That is not going to happen. What you want to try to do is to reduce the impact. Obviously, you want to fix some of those, but there are some that they either cannot be fixed or it's too expensive to fix. So you want to reduce the impact. Okay? Now, you can see that when we talk about identifying the value, right, in dollar, right, the financial value, the monetary value of your assets, and therefore the monetary value of those risks, the monetary impact of those risks. That means that you need to be able to identify, for example, how much money the organization is going to lose in case that, for example, vulnerability is actually exploited, right? So, this is a question that you must be able to answer. First of all, what is the impact? That's the business impact analysis or the monetary impact analysis. And once you have that, you need to be able to rank according to their severity. Now, this severity, again, it can be measured monetarily, it can be technically measured, right? So, for example, the technical damage, right, or the technical impact. Well, you have uh, there is a risk of a specific workstation going down, stop working, and there is also the risk of a server going down. Well, technically speaking, it may look like the server going down generates higher impact, right? Now, monetarily speaking, let's say that this server is offering a service that is not that important, and at the same time, that workstation is a workstation that is critical. The person that uses that workstation is running, is computing the salaries for the month, or closing the salaries, or um, computing, generating the reports that will determine how much each employee will get paid in that month. So, what this person is doing is actually critical, much more critical than that server that is running a service that's not that important, right? So, relative values are comparative judgments made to ensure that the most valuable information assets are given the highest priority. So, for example, which information asset is the most critical to the success of the organization, which information asset generates the most revenue, which information asset generates the highest profitability, which information asset is the most expensive to replace, so forth, so on. Again, questions that you want to ask and find the answer in order to determine which ones are the most critical assets, right? So, for example, as far as data, this is one way of doing it, right? Very technical. You want to classify your data or classify your digital um, uh, services, right? So you have a data classification and you have the impact to profitability. Observe that this will be very subjective. This is why in risk management you need to identify the owner of your assets, or the owners actually of your assets, right? Because it's the owner that will determine this, that will determine how critical, how important, how impactful each of those assets are. Okay. Now, in regards to the impact on revenue, this is another way of doing it. So again, observe that here we're doing a technical analysis and here we're doing a monetary analysis, right? So for example, the criterion weight ranging from 1 to 100. So you have EDI document, again, the same resources here, right? But again, this is a technical comparison, and here we have a monetary comparison. The EDI document set 1, logistic bill of leading to outsourcer, outbound, right? The impact on revenue is 0.8. As the impact on profitability is 0.9. The impact on public image is 0.5. So we can see that this document set here, in regards to the monetary impact, this is really, really high, right? 75. Maybe the technical analysis here, well, although it matches, right? The impact to profitability is very, very high, and which is very similar to SAT 2, the EDI document SAT 2, right? But again, you can see that in regards to the monetary impact, the EDI document SAT 2 is actually more critical than SAT 1. So if we take a look at this customer order via SSL, we can see that the impact to profitability is critical. Data classification is confidential, and it matches, right? The customer order via SSL, as far as the impact on revenue, right, or the monetary impact, is also the most critical one. But you may have situations where, technically speaking, you have something that is critical, right? And in regards to the monetary impact, maybe not that much. So again, there is a trade-off there, but you must remember that both should be considered. Okay? Now, another thing that is also very, very important is how to assess threats, right? The following questions can help in understanding the various threats and their potential effects on an information asset. So for example, which threats represent an actual danger to our organization's information, which threats are internal and which are external, which threats have the highest probability of occurrence, which threats have the highest probability of success, which threats could result in the greatest loss if successful, which threats are the organization least prepared to handle, which threats cost the most to protect against, and which threats cost the most to recover from. Now, the first thing that we need to understand here is, okay, oops, I'm sorry. First, we were focusing on assessing values in information assets. So we were trying to assess how important the assets are, right? The value of the assets. Another thing is the value of the threats. Okay? Because again, just like you have assets that might be very, very important, right? Might be if that asset is very expensive, for example, if that asset, a router, for example, okay? If the router stops, then the network connectivity goes down, which means that only the internal network will work. All of your employees will have no internet connectivity anymore, obviously, and also your clients won't have connectivity to your servers, which means that maybe not even your your homepage, the company page, the company website will not be accessible anymore. The impact is as high as it can get, right? So that's your asset. Now, another thing is a threat. A threat is simply the existence of something that can cause harm. But that same router, which is the asset, it's a critical asset, is this asset vulnerable to a specific threat? That's another analysis that you must be able to conduct, right? Okay, what are the assets? Well, there are so many I'm sorry, not assets. What are the threats? There are so many threats out there, right? First of all, you need to identify the threats that are actually posing a threat to your assets. Okay? Now that you were able to identify those threats, which of those threats will actually impact and how severe is that impact going to be? So that you can then start to focus on the most critical threats, the most, let's say, realistic, impactful threats, right? So some examples here, you have software piracy or other copyright infringement. You have fluctuations in power, data, and other services. You have unauthorized access and data collection or data collection, right? So here are some examples of threats: compromises to intellectual property, deviations in quality of service from service providers, espionage, forces of nature such as an earthquake, such as a hurricane, right? Human error. These are actually threats. These are, like I said, harmful situations, right? But again, are your assets vulnerable to those threats? That is the analysis that you must be able to conduct. Okay? Now, vulnerability assessment is doing exactly that. Considering I have my assets, I have these threats. Are my assets vulnerable to these threats? If they are, then I want to address the vulnerabilities. I do not want to address the threat. I want to address the vulnerability, because the vulnerability is an open door to that specific threat or a number of those threats. If I eliminate the vulnerability, the threats, they continue to exist, but they have no impact against my assets. So once the organization has identified and prioritized both its information assets and the threats facing those assets, it can begin to compare information asset to threats. This review leads to the creation of a list of vulnerabilities that remain potential risks to the organization. Okay? Vulnerabilities are specific avenues that threat agents can exploit. A list should be created for each information asset to document its vulnerability to each possible or likely attack. Actually, risk, guys, is measured by the product between the likelihood and the impact. That's how you measure risk, the product between likelihood and impact. So the likelihood is the chance or the chances of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat. And the impact is, in case this vulnerability is exploited, what is the impact? What is the damage? How bad is it going to be? So observe that, considering that we are computing the product between vulnerability, between likelihood and impact, right? If the likelihood means the chances of a vulnerability being exploited, but there is, if you consider a situation where there is no vulnerability, vulnerability equals zero. Therefore, the likelihood, the probability of the vulnerability being exploited is going to be zero as well. If there is no likelihood, likelihood equals zero times the impact. It doesn't matter what the impact is. Likelihood is zero. Zero times whatever the risk is zero. So even mathematically speaking, you can see that just the existence of a threat does not mean anything. Your systems, your assets, they must be vulnerable. The vulnerabilities must exist in order to have a threat able to exploit that vulnerability. Okay? Now that you understand the relation between threat and the asset, and you are now capable of measuring that impact. Okay? So you want to build a worksheet similar to this one. Now, there are different methodologies, right? If you use the NIST CVSS scoring system, you're not just going to come up with this type of worksheet. You have a worksheet that will actually measure in numbers the impact of that specific vulnerability in case it is exploited. Okay? Now, at the end of the day, this is what you need to observe. Here you have the NIST generic risk model, with key risk factors. So for example, again, you have to observe that there is a threat source, right? If there is a likelihood of initiation, then you have the threat event. The threat event can exploit a vulnerability, again, in case there is a likelihood of success, right? Now, this vulnerability, you also need to measure the vulnerability. What is the impact of that vulnerability in case it is exploited? So again, you have the likelihood and you have the impact, you have the severity. That is going to cause an adverse impact, producing the organizational risk. This entire model here can be summarized, like I said before, by the product between likelihood and impact. It's likelihood times impact. If there is no chance of a vulnerability being exploited, For example, the vulnerability does not exist. It doesn't matter how many threat sources are out there. But if you do have vulnerabilities that are vulnerable to numerous threat sources, right? Then you want to measure the likelihood first. Okay, the vulnerability exists, but what are the chances of that vulnerability or those vulnerabilities actually being exploited? For example, if I have a software, a Microsoft Windows operating system, Microsoft Windows 10, and there is a known vulnerability there, right? But the type of attack to leverage that vulnerability requires a network transmission, such as a malware. A malware must be transmitted from the attacker to that machine, the target machine. But there is a firewall in between that path, and this firewall is actually capable of filtering that malware out. Well, then the likelihood just went down, it just dropped drastically. So again, the vulnerability exists, the threat source exists, but the likelihood just went down. It's, let's say, close to 0% because of my firewall. But let's say another situation where I don't have that firewall. Well, then the likelihood is pretty high. Okay. The next thing that I need to address is the severity, the impact. I have this machine, it's vulnerable, I have the threat is capable of exploiting that vulnerability, but is it actually going to cause an impact? I need to identify those two values, likelihood and impact, that will give me the risk. Okay? That means that if a vulnerability is fully managed by an existing control, it can be set aside. If it is partially controlled, you need to estimate what percentage of the vulnerability has been controlled. Okay? Like I said, there are many, many different ways, many models out there that exist in order to assist you in ranking, not only addressing the identifying a value that can be assigned to each specific vulnerability, but it will also help you rank those vulnerabilities. Okay? And there it is. At the end of the day, this is what you want to achieve. Okay? And this is the Clearwater Compliance IRAM risk rating matrix, but the NIST CVSS scoring system is also very similar. It's basically the same. Okay, this is what you get. Okay, you have the probability combined with the impact that will determine if the risk is low, medium, high, or critical. Okay, and here's just another risk rating worksheet example. Okay, just an example, but a practical example. Observe that here we have the assets, we have the vulnerability, we have the likelihood of that vulnerability being exploited, and we have the impact in case that vulnerability is indeed exploited. That will give you the risk rating factor. Okay? So, customer order via SSL, inbound, right? We must remember that the customer order via SSL was actually, it was listed as a critical threat, right? But because of the likelihood, observe that the likelihood here is way too low. Again, the impact, very high, right? But the likelihood, very low. Therefore, look, this is the second last most let uh, most important, most severe risk. Okay. Now, when you actually conduct risk assessment, risk management, right? At the end of the day, you want to do the risk assessment deliverables. What are the deliverables? Information asset and classification worksheet, information asset value weighted table analysis, threat severity weighted table analysis, TVA controls worksheet, and finally the risk rating ranking worksheet. What does it mean? If you are hired to conduct risk assessment, right? To conduct risk assessment. So, which is different from risk management, because risk management includes risk treatment. But if you are hired to conduct risk assessment, it does not include risk treatment. In summary, what you're hired to do is to find the risks, determine how severe those risks are, and then say, hey, here are the risks, here are the most critical ones, okay? Here are, for example, if I were you, I would address these risks in this sequence, considering their severity. It does not include risk treatment. That is really, really important, okay? Assessing risks does not include solving or fixing the issues, okay? Now, you might be hired to conduct risk assessment, and then there is a chance of of your client actually saying, okay, now that you did risk assessment and this is what you're telling us, here are the issues. Can you also perform risk treatment? That is another service. Okay? But again, risk treatment means, in summary, means fixing those issues in case you can. What about the risks that you cannot fix? Well, you are going to try to mitigate, reduce the damage. Okay? Again, all this based on the rankings. Okay? There are risks that maybe they exist, but the impact, the damage is so small that you are not going to address it. You're not going to spend time and money on that. Okay? So, guys, that's what we need for our chapter 6, risk management, assessing risks. With this, we conclude this book chapter. Thank you very much.